Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism, the show where we get to hear from people who live in a socialist country, have lived in a socialist country, or have studied one extensively. This is your host, Tony, and what you just heard is a sample of Sakha music from the Soviet period, produced in 1968 by the local Communist Youth League. Links in the show notes to hear the full thing. In the second part of a two-part discussion, Sardana returns to continue discussing her recent study published through the Ziibiing Lab entitled Indigenous Diamonds, Extractivism and Indigenous Politics in the Diamond Province of Russia. In this part, we're going to be talking about the political participation of indigenous peoples during the Soviet Union and today, the impacts of extractivism on the region, and much more. Sardana Nikolaeva is a Postdoctoral Fellow with the Ziibiing Lab Global Indigenous Politics Collaboratory at the Department of Political Science of the University of Toronto. Her work broadly centers on Indigenous politics, Indigenous class and gendered experiences, geopolitical economy, economic sanctions, and extractivism. Sardana herself is Sakha. The study itself is linked in the show notes, so I hope you check it out. We'll also, in our discussion, be hearing about her own personal and community experiences of being both Soviet and Indigenous. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a Patreon subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus content. For example, you'll gain access to a third and final discussion that I had with Sardana, talking about a range of things from her experiences in the 80s and 90s, witnessing the fall of the Soviet Union and the transition into quote-unquote democracy, her thoughts on Western academic misunderstandings of her culture. You also get access to Notes for Comrades, which features a transcript of the episode, study questions, detailed notes, and further resources. I'd like to shout out to my new patrons since the last episode. Thank you so much, Danachka. I really could not do this without your support. If you're unable to contribute in this way, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode by following us on Twitter at AES The Podcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to leave a review, even if it's just a star rating, as those really boost the algorithm in my favor. I recommend checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance, as I have done other episodes featuring indigenous peoples of the Soviet Union. And as always, the most important thing you can do to help out this show is by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be for you. Enjoy the episode. In terms of the Sakha Republic, what did their participation look like in Soviet governance? Did they take part in the state functions?
They did, yes, and they still do. There is a full participation because the indigenous people, they are also citizens, right? Like the Soviet citizens. And every Soviet citizen had the right to participate in the political life of the nation state. So the representation of the indigenous peoples was something very important in the political sphere at the time. And not only in terms of the ethnic representation or cultural representation, but also the gender representation. For example, when I was doing my research in the rural indigenous villages in the Arctic, I mostly worked with the older local activists, older women, and all of them during the Soviet times, they were actively participating in the political life, not only of the communities, but also in the capital center, in the regional center. They were communists, they were members of the party, and they actively participated in the political public meetings. A lot of them, they told me stories about how they went to the biggest cities in order to represent their community. And they were elected, as the political representatives, again, of the communities, of the districts and such. So there was a full participation. However, there was a very interesting thing that I also noticed. There are very few research on the political participation of indigenous peoples during the Soviet times. But I found specifically women, because I was working with the women activists, so I was looking for some literature, socialist women, indigenous women. I found a couple of articles by the Western anthropologists, and they talked in a way that the political life didn't exist, for indigenous peoples during the Soviet times. They only became politically active after 1990s. And why they did that is because their understanding of political activism and what the politics is. According to them, the politics was, the very liberal understanding, right? Liberal understanding of the political being and the political acting. And therefore, because of their very Western, like centric understanding of the political activism, they kind of like completely disregarded the political life of indigenous women during the Soviet times. Like completely dismissed it, like saying that, like it was the Soviet regime, like they were just the part of the regime, and it wasn't necessarily a true political activism. So this is what I found, and I thought it was really interesting because again, the women who I talk to, who I still work with, they are political activists, and they have been very politically active all their lives. So I find these kind of writings to be very problematic because, again, essentially they're perpetuating this very one-dimensional understanding of politics and also the very Western-centric, very liberal interpretation of political activism as well.
It's quite ironic, too, if you think about it, because maybe those same commentators might suggest that, certainly the experience of Indigenous people isn't great in Canada or North America, but at least they can vote.
All right. Or they can protest, like they can come out and protest. Yeah. But the thing is that they say that, like the indigenous peoples at the time, they were apolitical, like during the Soviet times, they didn't protest. They're not allowed to protest. But at the same time, like when you think about that, did they have anything to protest for? Because if you look at what historically speaking, right, like the indigenous protesting in the context of the United States or Canada, like for example, so they're mostly, like trying to get access to education against the police brutality, and these kind of important things. However, again, like our experiences were very different. We had all of this. Was there any necessity to protest? I feel like we need to ask that question, right? And again, people were very active at the time, and I think like it's not surprising that in these villages, in these communities, in these indigenous communities, actually the most politically active members, they are the ones who grew up during the Soviet Union, and they were actually the most interested in the international indigenous politics. Like the older women, older men, and the younger people, they didn't have a lot of the interest in the global politics, in the indigenous politics, which is like, I found that to be very surprising. So it kind of like depicts, right, like what kind of the political experiences, the difference in the political experiences that the, like the younger people and the older people they had.
Like they had like a more internationalist perspective, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and they were the ones who were, like reading newspapers every day, like who were talking about the geopolitical conditions at the time, talking about the political system, critiquing the neoliberal economic system and the political systems. And it was like, like fascinating to me because I kind of like expected that the younger people would be more politically active, but it was the opposite. My hypothesis is that because of these are the members of the communities who were very politically active during the Soviet times. They had that political experience.
So that's fascinating. So I love this conversation. So just let listeners know that I had all these questions planned for Sardana.
We didn't cover anything.
Yeah. So no, that it's all good. The thing is, the good thing is that you're answering things actually, just not necessarily in the order that I anticipated, which is great. Moving on a bit here, specifically targeting a major aspect of the study that you've recently put together about diamond extractivism and the Sakha Republic and indigeneity, etc. Diamonds, when I think of diamonds, I just think of like a ring, a diamond ring and stuff like that. But in terms of diamonds as a commodity, as a resource during the Cold War, what did that look like? Did it go beyond, and what did this mean for people of the Sakha Republic?
It's an excellent question because this is actually something that I didn't know myself. I learned it when I was looking through the literature, the history of the diamond production in my home region. On the first place, the diamond industry, it only started as the response to the economic sanctions from the capitalist countries of the Soviet Union. Right after the World War II, the Western capitalist countries, they were so feared of the Soviet Union that they decided to, slap a number of the very harsh economic sanctions on the Soviet Union and also of any socialist state at the time, like, for example, Korea. So they banned the access of the Soviet Union to the international market of some of the commodities. And the diamonds were included in these commodities because during the World War II and a little bit after that, all the people of the world realized the importance of the technical diamonds, not necessarily the gem diamonds, but of the technical diamonds and the weapon production. Weapon production in military and also in the development of science. When you close the access to the international market, to the specific commodities, the other nation states, they would need to find another source. So when they slapped the economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, they were no longer able to buy specifically technical diamonds from South Africa, from European companies, for example. And they're important. And that's why they decided to try to find deposits of diamonds within the Soviet Union. So they kind of realized, we have all of this land, all of this territory, they're bound to be some diamonds here. And in the early 1950s, there was this theory that the geological formation in my home region was very similar to the geological formation in South Africa. Specifically in the areas where the diamonds at the time were mined by the company De Beers. They followed that hypothesis, that theory that there should be diamonds. And they started the geological explorations in early 1950s in my home region. And in 1954, they found diamonds. So the very, very big deposits of diamonds. However, again, as I mentioned, the Soviet Union, the Soviet government first were predominantly interested in the technical diamonds that they could use in the military and the science development. However, they soon realized the value of gem diamonds specifically for the Western consumers. Most of the foreign currency since 1950s, most of the foreign currency, specifically US dollars, were coming to the Soviet Union through the sales of the gem diamonds to the United States and to the European, specifically to the European company De Beers, which is a South African European company, the largest one at the time. And De Beers was buying the 100% of all the diamonds extracted from my home region. So they had this partnership with the Soviet government that they're going to buy all the diamonds, specifically gem diamonds, mined in Sakha Republic. This is how all of this started in the 1950s, yeah. The very interesting, very funny story that in the 1970s, De Beers, the company, they had so many Soviet diamonds that they kind of feared that if they release all of these diamonds to the global diamond market, it's going to overwhelm it and crash the whole market. So what they did is they decided to come up with the new marketing for the specifically for the diamonds which were mined in the Soviet Union, and they come up with the advertisement, which is the Eternity Ring. Yeah, and I write about that in the 1970s, and it became very popular because Eternity Ring was the ring that the husbands would gift their wives after the several years of living together. So that's why it's Eternity Love, Eternity Ring. And it didn't have only one big diamond, one stone. It had several smaller stones. And all of these stones were Soviet diamonds. So there is a very interesting, the very funny story is at the height of the Cold War, which is 1970s, right? At the height of the Cold War, the American husbands were gifting their American wives the Soviet diamonds.
That must have been the Soviet Union's plan to, overthrow the U.S. government through diamonds.
Exactly, but it was coming through the Europe, right, against South Africa.
Through De Beers, yeah, that's not something that I had anticipated, the Soviet government working with them. That brings to light another question. In terms of labor and actually extracting the diamonds themselves, because I'm just picturing in my head the diamonds being mined in South Africa. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming vast majority Black African people who were in these mines during apartheid, worst conditions imaginable. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's an assumption, but I think it's a pretty fair assumption. But in terms of this labor in the Sakha Republic, what did that look like? Was it a similar terrible conditions? Was it
It was very different because it was a nationalized economic endeavor, right? Especially during the Soviet Union. Most of the people who were employed within the diamond industry were migrant workers, the white settlers. And there are not a lot of the local people employed with the whole industry. However, the conditions were very different because it was the nationalized industry. So the workers, they had their rights. And they received as I mentioned before, it became very lucrative to have a job within the industry because the migrant workers, they were receiving all the different benefits, but also in addition to that, they had higher wages in comparison to Central Russia, for example. They also had, some additional subsidies because of the living in these and working in these harsh environmental conditions. They had all of these extra vacations. And they received the free housing, free trips, to go to sanatorium and all of that. So the labor rights, of course, they are much, much higher because labor was very valued. So I don't have, criticism about the conditions, what kind of conditions the people worked at that time. But I would personally have the criticism of who was employed in this industry, because they are not necessarily local people employed by the industry. Because, for example, in my village, because I grew up again, as I mentioned, in the diamond mining hub in 1950s, literally where the diamonds were found first. So I remember that the people who worked in the diamond mining industry, they actually had their own shop. Yeah, they had their own store, which was only for them. And in that, we're not allowed to go there, because my parents, they didn't work in the diamond industry. And a lot of the local people, local indigenous people, they also didn't work there. So we're not necessarily were welcomed, inside the store, which is completely inaccessible to us. And but we're very curious because they had all of these commodities which were not sold in regular shops and the stores that we could go. So this is one of the benefits, right? One of the benefits of working within the diamond industry. However, there is also these oppressive, I would say, the practices, of that, specifically towards the local indigenous people who are not employed within the industry itself. But this completely changed in the 1990s when the diamond mining industry became nationalized in a very different way. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the big industries, they became completely vandalized, right? Vandalized by the economic opportunists, who are now oligarchs. And the diamond mining industry wasn't an exception. And I actually remember that in the 1990s, they were generally, in the whole Russia, there was this horrid criminal activities, a lot of the criminal organizations. And I would actually say that a lot of the oligarchs who are now in Russia, they came from that, from this, they had some connections with the criminal organization. I personally believe in that. So anyways, and a lot of the criminal activities and all of this such, and my home village became notorious because of the crimes, because of the mafia. And everyone knew about that. Everyone within Sakha Republic, if we ask them, they know about that my home village was a criminal village. And I was thinking about why it happened like that, and then I realized that it was because of the diamond mining, because diamond mining in the 1990s was a very lucrative piece. Anyone who has access to that can become rich very easily. So what happened is in the 1990s, after the whole economic system of the Soviet Union collapsed, is that the diamond mining industry specifically became the focus of the new government. And the new local indigenous government, they essentially nationalized the diamond mining industry, and they created the company, which is now the largest diamond mining company in the world, Alrosa. So in the beginning, the local indigenous people, they had most of their revenues because it was nationalized to benefit local people. not necessarily, like as during the Soviet Union, that it was the nationalized industry to benefit all the people within the Soviet Union, but this was like specifically for the people in my home region. So this is kind of like very different way of nationalizing the economy. So the nationalization of the diamond mining industry and the creation of the diamond mining company. And one of the requirements of the new company was to hire local people in order to kind of like alleviate the unemployment that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Through the revenues of the diamond mining industry, which De Beers still was buying the diamonds from the company, from my home region. So they wanted to somehow invest it in the local communities, in the local economy. However, it also changed in the early 2000s when the new neoliberal Russian government, they decided that it's too much, for, like too much of the benefits, too many privileges that, like Sakha Republic government has, and and all of these revenues, too many revenues are coming to the local people. So they decided, like partly also privatize the company itself, the largest company that now, the largest company within the region. So nowadays, it's partly privatized because the Alrosa is the open, I think I'm trying to remember how they call it. It's a public company. So meaning that they sell shares to the public. But still though, the 32% of shares of this company belong to my people. We do have interest in the company. So 32% belongs to the regional government, to the local people. 32% belongs to the Russian government, to the Russian central government, and the rest belongs to the private organizations, private companies, and the private individuals. Those kind of like floating around. And it's really interesting because, out of those, public floating shares, most of the shares, they actually belong to the private individuals in Europe and in the United States. which I find to be very interesting because the company was sanctioned this year, but the United States, they sanctioned the company in 2022 after the start of the whole conflict with Ukraine. So they sanctioned the company and they sanctioned the diamond mining industry, like generally, claiming that, that the company is providing the revenues for the Russian government. And I find that to be very misleading because, yes, 32% probably, they're going to the central Russian government. However, 32% they're coming to indigenous people. 32% of the shares belong to my people. And we do get the percent of the revenues. And most of the revenues, they go to subsidize development of education, access to education to the indigenous peoples within the communities which are affected by the diamond mining. They go to the development of infrastructure, which is really important, again, because it's Arctic. They also fund, this cultural projects, social cultural projects, access to the health services, and etc. So this is the revenues. They are not just revenues that go to the Russian government as these, as the United States and the European, these completely unhinged, politicians, they argue. They go directly to indigenous peoples and they sustain local indigenous communities. And I find that to be very problematic, that they say these kind of things, not knowing the nuances.
That's a very good point because often, sanctions in the way they get brought up in Western media, it's like meant to like target government officials or the government or something. But it's like the people in the government, they're fine. Like,
Yes,
they're not they're not hurting. They're like, oh, that's unfortunate. Oh, well, but, the money could be going, or the vast majority, I'm sure, of, money that often get sanctions are for resources for people, right?
Yeah, exactly. And and when you think about that, and one of the things that people, all of these politicians get is that our regional budget, up to 47% of our regional budget comes from the diamond revenues.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's a lot. And it's, unfortunately, it's because of the history of the diamond mining industry in my home region. And I don't like that because, this kind of dependence on one industry is not necessarily is a good thing, because diamond mining is not something that happens eternally. It doesn't have any future.
Mhm.
It doesn't have any future, right? However, it's so much ingrained in the local economy, in the local politics, and in the local social life and the cultural life that it's very difficult to imagine the future without diamond mining and the present without the diamond mining, which I find it to be very problematic. Yes. However, again, at the same time, at the present, there is this economic dependence and the political dependence. And I just, disappointing that people don't understand that.
Would you say that this kind of dependence on the diamond industry, because like historically, many colonized countries they've had their economies forced to be like almost a single resource, whether it's like oil or some other, useful resource such as that. Is that the case in the Sakha Republic, where it's like, I'm not sure if the Soviet part is in relation to that, because there's other economies, traditional economies in operation as well. But is the Sakha Republic kind of like that, like a uni-resource economy?
I think it was very different during the Soviet times, because again, the nature of the diamond industry at that time was that all the Soviet citizens, they benefit from the diamond mining industry, right? So it didn't necessarily belong to only local people. It belonged to all the Soviet people, and the revenues, they were distributed equally. And we also, at the time, we had more developed agriculture, because the agricultural development was subsidized by the Soviet government. But also we had other industrial developments which provided the employment opportunities for the local people. For example, the electric station, like electricity station, which is also very problematic. Considering I also wrote a little bit about that, the building of the dam in order to provide the electric power to the growing diamond mining industry, by the way, actually. So, this adjacent industries to diamond mining industry, they still provide the employment opportunities for local people, right? So it wasn't necessarily, bad thing, and it wasn't necessarily a good thing. It was like a very complex picture. But now it's very different. Again, a lot of the other ways of being employed, and also most of the provisions, like the food, health service, like medical, services and everything, they were provided by the state. But now they don't. They are not, right? They are not. So this is the difference. So despite the fact that there was not necessarily this economic dependence, the economic dependence on the mining industry, because there were other ways, but also most of the human needs were satisfied by the Soviet government. But now it's very different. After 1990s, most of the services, they completely disappeared. Infrastructural development completely stopped. And all of the commodities that before were provided by the Soviet government, they don't exist now. And so therefore, I feel like the dependence on one, as you say, right, like on one industry, like, for example, oil, and in our case, diamonds, it's much more critical for the economic stability in the region. Because if it collapses, everything is going to collapse. Like, most of the things are going to collapse. Because, again, 47% of regional budget coming from the diamond mining revenues is not a joke. It's not a joke, because it's a huge number. And also considering that how the local government spends this money, I think it becomes even more critical to think about the effect of the sanctions, of the economic sanctions on the company. However, at the same time, it doesn't mean that I support extractivism, because people might understand, these kind of conversations that way. I don't. I'm very much anti-extractivist, specifically because I come from the community that have been affected by diamond mining industry for, as I mentioned, for 3 generations, and they're very different, multifaceted effects of that.
Could you explain some of those effects? What are some of those impacts?
Of course, as you can guess, the environmental effects completely destroyed the local environment. And it's really important to us because, again, we depend on our traditional economic activities like hunting, fishing, and gathering. And the environmental changes, environmental transformations because of diamond mining industry are huge. We felt that, and we still feel that. And also health effects of the local communities because of the contamination of water, for example, or contamination of the rivers, for example, because of the construction of the dam. And also, if you don't know how the diamonds are mined, they are, like in my home region, they are mined in open pit. So essentially, you have this, like hole that you dig. And it's the hole is huge. It's not like small holes. It's a very, very, it's like humongous, like it's like super big. One of these open pit mines, as I've been told, they can be seen from the space. So you can imagine how big it is. And of course, imagine the environmental destruction in order to have that hole to be seen from the space. And it's still there. The number of them, they're still there. And because they are still in operation. And as you can imagine, there's a contamination going because of the local diamond mining factories, that belong to the company. They clean the soil, they mine soil in order to find the diamonds, right? And they do that using the specific chemicals. And then these chemicals with water, they're dumped in the local rivers. So, and as you can imagine, all of these chemicals, they get into water as well. So these are like one of the things, and the people, a lot of the people in my home village and also in the neighboring village, we have been suffering from the different kinds of cancer, and also I'm trying to remember what was it. I actually wrote about that in my study. So the chemicals, they affected the health through the water. So these are like some of the things that have been the effects of the diamond mining industry on the local health.
I can even draw a parallel there between, the region of Nigeria that I'm from, the southeast, where oil is a huge thing. Western, or multinational oil corporations have just been able to do essentially whatever the hell that they've wanted.
Yes.
They're like just dumping sewage into the water. I mean, that's not even getting to like labor conditions and stuff like that.
Right. I was actually going to say like one of the things about that. I forgot about that because this is the partly nationalized company and it's a big company. So therefore, they are actually heavily regulated by the government, which is not something that you say that in Nigeria and I imagine in South America, like these kind of big companies, they are not necessarily regulated by the government.
No regulation, bare minimum, yeah.
But this is the largest company and it brings a lot of revenues. And they are not necessarily private. They're not privatized in comparison to these kind of big companies in Russia. Because like part of it belongs to us, right? Like some part of the shares. So essentially it's partly nationalized. So, and because of that, there are specific regulations that the company must follow, federal regulations and regional regulations. What it means that is local people, they can actually demand, like some kind of, they can create the repercussions, and the appeal on behalf of the communities that are affected by the diamond mining industry to regional government and the federal government. And also they can do that as indigenous people, as indigenous people who practice traditional economies. However, but also, so there is like legal opportunities, legal opportunities that the local indigenous people, they can actually use in order to demand some kind of
like concessions or
yes, probably like for the environmental impact or something like that. However, the currently the federal government much more interested in the keeping the economy intact because of the sanctions. and because of the conflict, right? So therefore, the indigenous appeals are not necessarily paid attention to. They are not necessarily considered. So the extractivism, like extractive activities, they become prioritized. However, but at the same time, the indigenous rights, they are protected by within the legal framework of the Russian Federation. But because of the geopolitical conditions, they affected the protection of the indigenous rights.
That's a very good materialist analysis. It's very, very communist of you.
but it's true. It's true though.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
It's true. Yeah,
though.
that's true.
And one of the things that happened recently is because the company is increasing its production. And at the same time, they didn't pay their revenues, and taxes for the regional government for the last 2 years. And they claim that it was because of the sanctions. However, at the same time, they're increasing their production. And I think that because they are trying to find, a different market for the diamonds. So I don't know what's going to happen next. So I keep an eye on that, but I would be actually very interested to see what's going to happen after that. So this is very, again, material effect on the quality of life of the local indigenous communities, because again, the company didn't pay its taxes, local and regional taxes, and they didn't provide the revenues that it's supposed to for the last 2 years. So, and therefore, I've been reading the news updates on some of the projects that were funded by these revenues, that they're frozen now, that they stopped it because they don't have money coming. And these are the projects that they are social projects. They are not they are projects that benefit the local communities. For example, infrastructural development. What they mean by that is, for example, building school or building kindergarten, or the improving the houses for older members of the communities, or providing heat. Building the heat system. So these are the things that are funded by the diamond mining revenues. When they're not coming, all of these projects are not going to continue. And you can't get this kind of money from the federal government.
They have to generate the revenue there.
Yes, It only comes from the revenues.
So was there anything else that you want to say about your paper before we wrap up this discussion on that?
I just want to advertise it.
Yeah, for sure. Advertise it. Go ahead, please.
If anyone is interested in the histories of extractivism, not only diamond mining industry, but also the indigenous histories in encounters with extractivism. If anyone is interested, please read this study, because it's very interesting. A lot of the information that could be good to think about, but also to think critically about other people's histories, in a sense. If anyone is interested in building some kind of solidarities, based on the similar experiences with neoliberal capitalism or neoliberal extractivism, or the indigenous experiences, I would be very happy to hear from you. I'm always open for discussions, but I'm sure that you'll find a lot of the very good information in the study.
Awesome. I was going to say thank you much, Sardana, for this discussion. We've covered some of the key points in the paper, in the study that you've just kind of mentioned there, but we did not cover everything. So I highly recommend
exactly.
People take the time to check it out. Again, it's sometimes on this show, I recommend people read very dry papers, but this is not one of them. This is color, this is photos, this is images. It's very clearly organized. So
and the photos, and all of the photos, they come from my own collection. Some of the photos of my own community, of my own village, some of the photos from the villages where I did my research in the Arctic region. And also, it's also the illustrations are beautiful, right? And these are the illustrations by the indigenous artist, indigenous Yukagir artist from the Sakha Republic. And I worked with the artist before. And when I was writing this study, I wanted to specifically use and labor and work of try to expose, like the works of the local, very talented indigenous artists. And that's why we kind of like made the point in our lab that if we're going to use any illustrations, we're going to commission indigenous artists. And we're very happy to work with Ekaterina Solzhaninova, the Yugagir artist. And we're extremely happy how it came out. And it's very nice synergy, right? Like it's very unique and perfect synergy between the representation and also the content and the illustrations and the content of the study. And it's also important because Ekaterina herself, she comes from the community that have been affected by the extractivism. So she has this deep understanding, very personal understanding of the problem.
It definitely makes the study itself more engaging, yes, more kind of real by adding that imagery. So that's great. People certainly should check it out. So thanks again, Sardana.
Thank you.